My name is Bruno Mweemba, and you're watching the Africa for Dummies podcast.
Welcome to Africa for Dummies, the podcast where we break down complex issues across the continent into conversations that are insightful, accessible, and occasionally a little provocative. In today's episode, I sit down with Bruno Mweemba, a development finance expert turned farmer and innovator. We talk about his meeting with US Vice President Kamala Harris, the challenges of subsidies in African agriculture, and his mobile app that's changing how farmers access capital. Bruno also shares practical wisdom on how young people can avoid common pitfalls when starting out in farming and what it really takes to succeed in a tough but promising industry. But before we get into it, my name is Nathan, and this is the Africa for Dummies podcast, where we explore African realities with clarity, depth, and just a bit of an edge. If you enjoy this type of content, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us reach more people who are interested in Africa's future. Let's get into it.
I am an African.
All right, welcome everyone to Africa for Dummies. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Bruno Mweemba, a development finance expert, author, and managing director of Panuka Farm in Zambia. We'll be talking about his journey from finance to farming, what it was like hosting US Vice President Kamala Harris, and the bigger picture of African agriculture, from financing challenges to youth involvement and policy reform. Bruno, thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right in.
Yeah, pleasure's mine.
So let's begin with your journey, transitioning from a finance expert to a farmer and author. What inspired that shift into agriculture, and how has your background in development finance influenced how you operate Panuka Farm?
Okay, that's $1 million question. I'll try by all means to remember all the different pieces. Yeah. So the larger part of my life, in, maybe growing up, I actually spent it a bit on a farming enterprise. And fast forward, my early days were in the military. That's where I spent my early time in the Air Force. And, yeah. But then, while I was in the Air Force, basically, I did finance. In the early 2000s, yeah, I became a chartered accountant, SCCA. But then I had an opportunity also to work in a banking setup, corporate finance, and then gravitated much more into accounting, National Aids Council, financial controller for Swedish CEDA, and then landed at the India Agriculture Policy Research Institute as director of finance for about 5 years. So much as I kind of partly grew up on a farming enterprise, but I think my stay at the India Agriculture Policy Research Institute, which is basically an agriculture research institute, kind of gave me quite a lot of insights on what was going on in the agriculture sector. And therein, for me, I think I saw an opportunity to contribute because you agree with me that there's quite a lot of experts in different fields, even in agriculture. Unfortunately, we advise theoretically from air-conditioned bodies. Yeah. Um, but you see, what the farmer out there needs, an emerging farmer, they're actually looking for heroes, champions that can basically walk their talk, as opposed to just, you show up in a bucky, 20 minutes, about soil, this, that, and then back in your air-conditioned, office. And so basically, I felt I needed to, step in and look at how I would actually create a farming enterprise that would be like a model, farming enterprise for smallholder and emerging farmers. And I think the first challenge that I was actually debunking back then is Zambia was hit by one of the worst droughts again, about 2016, 2017.
Yeah, I believe it was the El
Yeah,
Nino,
yeah,
El
yeah.
Nino,
So
El Nino
around
drought.
that time, we had load shedding, as we call it here in Zambia, and most of the farming enterprises also were gravely affected. But then there was quite a lot of myth around: can you actually manage a farming enterprise, off grid? At the time, I had actually started my PhD in development finance and focusing on energy, and I felt okay, probably this would be my thesis, but in practice. some kind of action research, and basically that's how I established Panuka, Enterprise, you know, which then has Panuka Farm. And we actually set it out as an off-grid, farming enterprise. Mainly, first was actually to debunk this myth that you can't use solar to run, a smallholder or emerging farming enterprise. So, yeah, but then obviously with a focus on farming as a business, and so basically merged my academic experience as a chartered accountant, but also given that I have done development finance amongst my postgraduate qualifications, and yeah, meshed all this to develop this enterprise that was going to be poised as a torchbearer for smallholder and emerging farmers, with a view on practically how to mainstream all these environmental, social, and governance issues, and then the nexus with finance, and all that. Yeah.
To be honest, you've achieved quite a lot in the Zambian farming industry, and that's really impressive. I didn't know you had the African, the military background either, and which touches on resilience, which I was going to ask about later. But since you've mentioned it, I'm now curious. How has your military background helped you in terms of resilience? I've tried farming myself, and I can say it's incredibly difficult. And the fact that you're doing it with solar is like trying to farm with one hand tied behind your back.
Well, to be honest, I think having gone through military was one of my greatest things that I ever did. You know, because it actually instills you quite a lot of discipline, but also belief in yourself. Um, yeah, and you basically feel okay. The world is now your playground. But then if you bring in the military discipline and also the ethos of conquering, you know, yeah, that makes has really been very catalytic, I think, for me in my life, and also the way I face different challenges, my disposition in doing things, and I think you hinted, my hosting of the former U.S. Vice President, and yeah, I remember a colleague who is actually one of the ambassadors in one of the countries, like, hey man, you look too calm, like, yeah, I mean, we get trained for that. She's a human being. Yeah, she may be a vice president, but yeah, I think we trained to basically handle everything and anything. And yeah, for me, it was just like, okay, yeah, it's D-Day, it's a good challenge, and let's roll. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that fits into our next question. In 2023, you mentioned you had the rare opportunity of hosting former U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris at your farm, which is an extraordinary moment. Can you share what that meant to you personally, and also what it represented for Zambian agriculture more broadly? You mentioned staying calm, but I imagine it was a powerful moment. What were some key messages exchanged between you and Kamala Harris during that visit? Uh, Actually, I can't remember the last time a high-ranking U.S. official,
yeah.
visited Zambia in that way. What impact did it have, and what conversations or takeaways came from that exchange?
Well, very often, most of these chances come because you are working for either UN, you are working for a government, and you have this opportunity basically to meet some of these dignitaries. But when what brings such a high level dignitary to you is because of something that you created from scratch, it hits different. So given that, I mean, I started farming, Panuka farm from scratch. Firstly, to my kids, I mean, I've got three kids who also were present and had a private moment with the former U.S. Vice President. It's also just for them to believe that, oh, okay. I could actually see, especially for my older children, for them to actually realize that, oh, so that is doing something meaningful. Yeah, because for the millennials and the Gen Zs, agriculture is not just not their kind of thing. But I think it helped me, on my, in the case of my kids, for them to realize that okay, so that is doing something that is worth us paying attention. But also just the fact that, yeah, she came, lots of dignitaries coming through. Um, for me, as a development finance practitioner, as a person, it was like a proof of concept. I mean, you don't see a U.S. vice president just coming anyhow. I think they did quite a lot of due diligence. Exactly, and I think in my kind of discussion with her, I got that immediate feedback, like, "Hey, Bruno, I like what I'm seeing here," and I think we had very intelligent, discussions. So it's like a validation of what I'm trying to do, and so yeah, that was quite uplifting for me as a validation of proof of concept of something that I created from zero scratch. 8 years later, yeah, to host the U.S. vice president. By the way, a year before that, I actually hosted the World Bank managing director, so it was like back to back. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's really amazing, and it kind of shows what you've accomplished with your farm. You mentioned that you started about 8 years ago, and you actually touched on some of the challenges you faced, like the El Nino drought, and I'm sure many other ones that you did along the way. Which brings us to the broader issue, which are the structural barriers in agriculture. And I think the biggest one that pops up in research is finance. Access to capital is sort of a big one that, one of the main ones that African farmers face. From your experience, what barriers do you come across when it comes to, financing? And how do you think we can change this? And how can we help small and medium scale farmers unlock, uh, you know, capital for themselves.
Thank you. So, being a chartered accountant, also the privilege of working in financial sector, banking, and then gravitating to work in the development finance space. One of the main challenges, really, like you said, is access to finance. But then there's a concept that we call bankability in this space, which is basically the acceptability of this agripreneur to be financed by either a bank, an impact investor, a VC, or any other provider of capital. And that's what bankability really entails. Now, the biggest challenge that we are actually having, and I think you can read some of the reports, like the state of agri SME finance that was done by SFS. Yeah. It actually shows that bankability is one of the biggest challenges. And that bankability is basically a demand and supply issue. So if I may just characterize what that is, on the demand side, you've got the agripreneur, the smallholder farmer. The smallholder farmer, unfortunately, can't tick the boxes of the requirements by the supply side. And their failure partly is out of, for lack of a better word, ignorance of, or not just knowing exactly what the funder is looking for. And we've had those issues even in Zambia where there's some semblance of impact investment that has actually come in Zambia, but 70%, if not higher, local agri SMEs actually fail to get that money. Why? Because they actually fail to tick the first five requirements by this impact investor. And some of them, for me, I think are a bit outrageous because I have seen where you've got funding that comes and says, okay, you need to have 300,000 euros annual turnover. Now, you need to understand, look, SME smallholder farmers are actually going to have, 2 to 300,000, euros. I mean, that's nothing, but you need to understand the context. So this is why I was saying it's a demand and supply issue because the suppliers of credit, in terms of the way they define the bankability requirements, is that they also don't understand the real circumstances of their would-be client. So when you put a threshold of turnover around 300,000, 250, you're already weeding out quite a lot of them. Beyond that, obviously there will be. Do you have audited financial statements? Stuff like that. Again, you know that you're already weeding out quite a lot of these, smallholder and medium farmers. So the biggest challenge, which is also a great opportunity, is that most of the agri SMEs are not corporatized enough, and as such, they actually get weeded out when there's a formal financial service that is actually intended to, provide, capital, be it even banks. Now they would require that you have, you know, quite some minimum corporatization around you. Obviously, you have to be fully registered, paying your taxes and all that. But realistically, you know that there are very few agri SMEs that are in that quadrant, and as such, they are typically weeded out from the formal financial services. So, you also asked me about what we're doing. So, by the way, I may actually preempt this. We are working on a platform called the Panuka Agribusiness Hub. Probably you can actually check it right here. And we're doing this in conjunction with Bongo Hive. Yeah, yeah. So as Panuka, we're basically developing this platform. By the way, we also just got some money from the government of Zambia to help us to put this together, which will basically be a platform towards helping most of these agri SMEs to get corporatized. So they'll go through our platform, answer quite a number of questions, which will basically give it will be an AI enabled platform, but it also scores them on various issues in basically what we call hygiene issues towards bankability. And that is not an audit, but some kind of system that just helps them to understand exactly where they are, what they need to improve. And based on their scores, we'll open up this platform to potential funders who will basically be able to look at, oh, this guy is scoring good, he's sorted out these issues, but it also gives you an action list of things that you need to improve on over time. So one of the solutions really is that we need to corporatize the agri SMEs to understand, and therein also lies the issue around financial literacy. The agri SME needs to understand how formal financial service, you know, market operates, and that's why we've also created the app, Panuka AgriBiz, which you can find on Play Store. And I think in a couple of weeks we are also working on a web app. You can find these financial literacy courses that we've created. One on risk management fundamentals for farming enterprise. We've got one on fundraising, farming as a business blueprint. We also have one on accounting and financial management, because we need to fix the brain first. Because if money comes, if this agripreneur doesn't understand why they need to do certain things, it will be a challenge for them to basically access finance. So we have what we're calling the Panuka TTL, which is the teach, and then you also provide technical tools, and then you link them to markets, link them to finance. So this is like our thesis on what we're working on towards access to finance. And we think what has been happening in this sector is that money will just come, but very little investment is going into reforming the mindset of the agripreneur in terms of real financial literacy, but also providing a platform where we can link accountants, auditors to help these agri, SMEs in terms of hygiene issues around their financials and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, and building on that, I think the approach you're doing is really innovative. You're using an app, uh, you know, but as you mentioned earlier, there's often a mismatch between international institutions, particularly in the West, and like the local context. Which leads me to ask, you spoke about financial literacy, but what about technological literacy? Since you're working with an app, do you think that unfamiliarity with the technology might be a barrier, especially in rural areas or even limited access? I read somewhere in countries like Kenya, these tech-based solutions have had mixed results because people in rural areas often face challenges, not just in accessing apps but also understanding how to use them effectively. How do you plan to address that gap?
Yeah, very valid question. By the way, the definitions around small scale, smallholder, kind of varies. I think during my time at IAPRI, we had different categories, obviously also from a government perspective. But what we are looking at ourselves in terms of target market is that agri SME that is actually intentional as farming as a business and not as a hobby or just as a livelihood. Yeah. So the expectation is that there must be some level of literacy, digital literacy, that is already there. But what they are missing is basically this farming as a business ethos. Our view is that the team down there, like the real small scale subsistence farmers, there's quite a lot of investment by quite a lot of players, even government and whatever. And that is not the space that we're actually looking to fill ourselves. We're looking at the missing middle of this smallholder and emerging farmer who's really intentional about farming as a business. By the way, you often hear me using the term agripreneur because we're not just restricted to a farmer, but we're also looking at the other ecosystem, players. It could be a fresh graduate like you. You said you're studying agricultural economics. You might want to set up an enterprise immediately after you graduate, or you are a livestock technician who wants to provide a service to farmers. So we think you also require finances. You also need access to market. So we are providing a service basically to all these ecosystem players, and mainly we are using the term agripreneur and agri SME beyond just primary production. Yeah. So even the platform that we are creating is actually catering for the other ecosystem players because just to give you one example, I've got a nephew that I stay with. He graduated from the University of Zambia doing vet medicine. And I kept telling him, hey, I know your appetite is join government, but I see that there's a huge gap in terms of livestock farmers who actually require your services. Um, and let me help you to basically corporatize and whatever. And I think he's been doing that. He registered his, vet, outfit. He now has an office. He just got himself a bike now, where he goes into the farms. Look, it's those kind of initiatives that we actually require, where we can actually breathe this agricultural entrepreneurship, agripreneurship as we call it, really even from those fresh graduates, so that you're not all jostling to look at jobs from government. There's a lot of opportunities that lies, and we're looking to basically enable all these kind of ecosystem players in the agriculture sector.
Yeah, no, it's really good that you mentioned agripreneurs. I honestly thought it was strictly for producers. And speaking of that, a little bit of a shameless plug here. Me and my friends are working on an app called Mombe, which is designed to help livestock farmers track and monitor their livestock. As you know, in Zambia, we deal with a lot of livestock theft, and so we want to see if we can help farmers be able to curb that. And so I think we'd be interested in registering with your platform.
Yeah,
Sounds like a great fit.
yeah. So right now, what is ready is the literacy part. So what we are now building is now the bankability readiness, scorecard, which that's how we're calling it, where you come in and then register, and then you begin to just run through the questions so that you see exactly what needs to be improved, so that then we're also onboarding along the way potential funders and all that. So yeah, we really look forward to you guys being maybe our first agripreneur client on the platform, and then yeah, test the platform. Yeah, just before this podcast, I was actually working on one of the bits of the assessment on financials. Yeah,
And yeah, building on that, there's even larger issues I think that African farmers, especially in Zambia, face, and that's like price volatility. Farmers find themselves as price takers, meaning that they don't usually set the price for their produce, and on top of that, it's an unpredictable market, meaning that the price goes up and down unpredictably. I think a good example of this is the tomato situation in Zambia. Tomatoes in Zambia tend to have, the prices can swing quite dramatically. I remember one time there was a time when, there was a shortage of tomatoes, so much so that the price went to like 400 US dollars per box or something. And then after a few months, there was an oversupply, which led people to throwing away a lot of tomatoes. Um, so the question is like, what can governments do to improve, the resilience and the profitability, especially of small scale farmers, considering there are lots of structural problems. I think one of them being that there's a group of people that are happy, with the status quo. So how can the government do this in such an environment?
well, that's another $1 million question. Yes, resilience. But I think maybe let me start with what the government can do, especially in terms of just helping the farmers. So I may share with you maybe after this one of the articles that I just recently, wrote, directed to government, given also some of the pain points that I thought, yeah, we probably can do something. So my take is that you see, there's what is called the Farmer Input Support Program. One of the issues with the Farmer Input Support Program is that it's a good program, but the challenge we have is targeting. And that is the same case with all other form of subsidies or government support. Because subsidies, I think the OECD defines subsidy as any form of government support. I think it's the simplest, easiest way to understand what a subsidy really is. Um, and most of these subsidies are actually well meant, very good intentions, but the challenge is implementation. And the greatest part of implementation is about targeting. Who are you targeting? Who is supposed to be the beneficiary of this? Now, having said that, um, I must respectfully say that not everybody who's in the agricultural space is a farmer. There's gardening, there's farming for survival and for profit and all that. Um, so the first thing that we actually need to understand is to cross-check who is really farming. Are they farming in Excel? Are they farming on the ground? Because there's a huge difference to transition from farming in Excel into really setting up a farming enterprise. Because there's quite a lot of huge opportunities. I don't know how much you remember, we had a goat opportunity supply in Saudi Arabia. Now, if what you have is people that are farming, you know, on Excel in their heads, you know, yeah, without understanding really what it takes to actually raise goats, how many goats are there, you might actually give phantom expectations and projections. So the first thing that I would actually want the government to do is that we need to create a database of who is doing what and at what stage, okay? Because any intervention that you bring must actually be targeted at the right, person. Whether it's livestock, if there's a livestock opportunity, you know who's been hustling in this space. Ourselves, we are hustlers in the horticulture farming space, and if there's an intervention, you flying to Egypt to link up these farmers or whatever, you are targeting the right people. But very often you will find maybe 80% are wannabe farmers. But I can tell you, to transition from a wannabe farmer to an actual farmer, the gestation period is actually long. So first is targeting. The second issue is, I have seen this in other countries where you need to understand that issues around food safety, certifications and all that, which then unlocks opportunities, especially for export, or indeed other forms of markets, even within Zambia here, are very expensive. And to expect every farmer at farm level to basically, get certified and whatever, that's expecting too much. So what I would actually expect the government to do, and this is something that has been done, I think in Rwanda, Kenya, you can have a certified facility at the airport that's run by government, or you can actually do a PPP. You have a private sector in partnership with government running this facility at the airport, and this would actually be available at a fee to farmers. So you bring your produce, and then you undergo this quality assurance. If it's your cucumber, the wrapping, and all the other different quality things. And then, I mean, you can have your ZRA and phytosanitary teams at that facility, yeah. And then you basically amalgamate the products and you find market. And this is where again I have a challenge with our embassies, especially the trade attaches. I think I can't feel them in terms of helping. Because if we find market for most of these, farmers, and then the likes of Zambia Development Agency and all the other, agencies help these farmers in the manner that I'm prescribing, that would actually go a long way. And I must actually also extend this even further. When I look at airlines like Kenya Airways, I mean, sometimes they would struggle. But one of the greatest things that Kenya Airways has actually done is to open up access to market by local horticulture farmers into the West. Because then the produce gets out there very quickly, fresh, you know. So we can also be very deliberate. We've created the national airline. The national airline must actually beyond just carrying people, but also cargo, agricultural produce. So we can actually be very deliberate, either have a specific cargo, plane, or deliberately just getting a bigger plane to make sure that we know that, okay, we will use this also for cargo for agri SMEs. Now, these are things obviously that are long term in nature. I'm not talking about abracadabra kind of stuff that just pops up. But it's these kind of dots that would actually help to unlock opportunities for the agri SMEs. So targeting, make sure that we provide these kind of incentives, and then we handhold these agri SMEs properly, access to markets, and make sure our embassies, especially the trade attaches, are functional to look for markets and also link in these agri SMEs, because the way it is now, every agri SME is actually thrown in the deep end to fish and swim on their own. I think there's too much focus on the higher end, the commercial farmers, the bigger guys, in terms of facilitation. But the aggregation model for the smaller guys, I think we're still missing something. Yeah.
I think it's a really great point, and I think a lot of what you said resonates, especially when we look at European markets. There's been a sharp rise in certification requirements, with more consumers demanding organic and ethically produced foods. That's good in theory, but it creates a barrier for farmers in countries like Zambia, where accessing those certifications isn't always feasible. I had an experience. A friend of mine, lives in Europe. He found this. He found coffee that was made in Zambia, and he had sent me a picture. And so I had actually planned to get some, but I thought I would grab some next week. By the time I went there the next week, it was completely sold out. In the whole country. So I mean, I couldn't get it anywhere. And it was really amazing to see that there's such great demand for Zambian products abroad. It sort of tells me that there's potential, which we may not hear about. We often hear about the challenges. So, yeah. Uh, which leads me to our last question. Here at Africa for Dummies, our goal is to always provide a platform for young people, and for people that are interested, to sort of learn more about the continent. And given the global uncertainty, COVID, inflation, climate change, and geopolitical shocks, what advice would you give young people looking to enter the agriculture space? What realistic role can young people play in reshaping African agriculture? And how can they become more resilient to some of these challenges that they're dealing with?
Great question. This is one area that I've actually been working on for the last 4 years. By the way, I'm happy to indicate that we've been running a graduate trainee program at Panuka Farm for the last now 5 years. I actually got some new graduate trainees yesterday, and we've been doing this in partnership with quite a number of agricultural colleges and universities. I think we've worked with NRDC, a bit with University of Zambia, a lot with the Zambia College of Agriculture, Monze. We also have the Kapasa Makasa University up north, and then Chipembi College of Agriculture. So we've basically been getting most of these graduates to come through to Panuka Farm for a 6 months graduate training program. Now, why did we create this? One is that my view, this might actually appear or sound very radical, is that the curriculum that we're using to train most of these agri SMEs is too theoretical. And so by the time they actually graduate, there's a very myopic view that farming happens in Cairo Road or some place out there and not in the soil. And then even when they come, you can actually see. And the beauty is that they're very honest. Like, hey, sir, we spent most of our time in class. They can hardly identify, either a fertilizer or certain crop, but these are the future advisors to the farmer. So the issue is that I think the first help is in terms of curriculum redevelopment. I think there's one college that we've worked with, which I think has the right, you know, way of doing things, which is Chipembi College of Agriculture. I think for them they've reinvented the curriculum where it's 80% practical and 20% theory. And you find that when I get graduates from there, they're a bit more functional, and they hit the road running. Yeah. So we need a lot more practice because, to be honest, unless you want to become a researcher in the lab, But if you're looking at really primary production, you need to actually interact with the environment. Of course, the science is extremely very important. So we need the balance, but I think we need to tilt quite a lot more for most of these, to interact with the real, farming environment. That way, then, is that you also see opportunities on how to run a farming enterprise, and of course, also how not to run a farming enterprise. But interestingly, also, one of the biggest issues that I've actually seen is most of the graduates also are failing to the social capital aspects in terms of how to interact with people that have not been to school, the mamas they find on the farm, the old men they find on the farm with very humble educational background. This is one interesting feature. Every time I do exit interviews, most of the graduate trainees, they'll tell you actually the hardest thing was managing a relationship with these folks because most of these you find probably they've grown up in urban areas and either just did agriculture accidentally. So they need to go through this immersion because you can't succeed if you can't manage people and if you can't interact with people. And this is a very, very critical component, especially for the youth. If you want to succeed, the people aspect is very key. You need to know how to work, interact with people, besides your academic, qualifications. So that's one thing that actually implore most of the youth to make sure that if you can volunteer and learn this. But also, I think the courses that we've created are also very good for most of these graduates because you also need to know how to run a farming enterprise, how to corporatize a farming enterprise, so that even as a graduate, you need to, begin to think about conceptualizing, potential opportunities that you might see. How do you create, a bankable problem? Because there's such a thing as a bank. It's not every problem that is bankable. So all those things are some of the things that you need to begin to learn, so that tomorrow when you think you have a very good solid idea and you want to launch it, you are also launching it the right way, and corporatizing yourself in the right way. So I think being open to learning, even when you have just graduated, and managing your ambitions, because this is one of the interesting things. I had a very interesting issue. I think one of the students, I think, graduated from Lungushi University, and they had an opportunity to go to Israel straight from there, And then when they come back, I told them, I still need to subject you to a graduate training program. And I could see the young lady took offense. Like, look, I mean, I'm a graduate. I went to Israel. I was like, young lady, this is a different environment. And I think if you can manage your ego and your expectation, you'll find there's room to learn quite a lot. So I would actually say for the youth, huge opportunities and age favors you. Even on the financing side now, you find there's a premium in terms of access to finance for the youth. But make sure that you set yourself the right way. Make sure you have the right mentality. Your people management skills must be excellent. Yeah. Otherwise, I think the future is good for you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to wrap it up on a positive note. Being open to learning, managing expectations, balancing ambition with patience is so important. And as you mentioned, there's real opportunity out there, especially since many financial investments tend to prioritize youth. Before we close, is there anything that you would like to promote? I believe you have written a book. Where can people find it, and how can they connect with you and learn more about the work you're doing?
Yeah, so I have written a book on farming as a business, handbook. That book I think is quite juicy. Lots of feedback that we've gotten, and we have basically vacuumed it from all the lullabies and motivational talk. I think it's quite punchy. So that book can actually be accessed on our app, Panuka AgriBiz app, which is found on Play Store. But you can also find the book on Kobo. It's one of the international platforms for books. So you just go on Kobo, search Bruno Mweemba, Bruno Mweemba with a double E, and you should be able to buy the book on Kobo. It's a global platform, so anywhere on earth you can actually be able to get it. But besides that, We have now the Panuka Agribusiness Hub that we are creating, and the bit what one piece of it is already out there, which is the mentorship courses that we've created, and we're also open to partnerships with universities that would want to have these students access these courses. I think we can work out a mechanism. NGOs that would want to finance access to students and all that, we open to that. Great courses, and pretty soon then we'll be unlocking now this access to finance aspect where you can basically do the bankability readiness scorecard, and then we open it up to funders. And so even those funders that are looking to finance agri SMEs in Africa, the platform is for you. We look forward to basically onboard you, and reach out to us. Write to me on panukafarm@gmail.com, or Bruno at panukaagribizhub.com. Happy to interact.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thanks to all our listeners and viewers. I'll be sure to include all the links to Bruno's work, his book, his apps, and more in the description below. Make sure to follow him on all platforms, especially Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. I think that's where on LinkedIn, sorry, is where I actually first came across the incredible work he's doing. And as always, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes.
All right, bye bye.
I am an African.